Okay, Article 1, the longest, what was considered by the founders the most important article, deals with Congress. So in this lecture, what we want to do is go through this piece by piece and get a very good understanding of what Article 1 says. Article 1, Section 1 talks about Congress being bicameral. Again, that's two houses. There is a House and a Senate, and it has all legislative power. That is something that means that the Congress has the right to make all the laws. The president cannot make laws. The courts cannot make laws. Congress makes all the laws. And Congress was, in fact, the most dominant branch of the government until, say, the 1930s and 40s. For most of our country's history, there were some exceptions. There were great presidents, of course. But for most of our country's history, Congress was the center of power in the United States. Article 2 talks specifically about the House of Representatives. And what it says is that the House of Representatives shall have representatives elected every 2 years. The term of a representative is 2 years. The idea behind this was to keep these representatives close to the people. You had to go back for re-election every session of Congress, every 2 years, to be re-elected. Now, to be in the House of Representatives, what are the qualifications? Well, you have to be 25 years old. You have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years, and you have to live in the district you represent. And that's it. When we talk about this, often students will be surprised, and they'll wonder, well, you don't have to be a college graduate, you don't have to speak English, you don't have to be out of jail. No. You just have to be 25 years old, 7 years a citizen, so you can be a naturalized citizen, and you have to live in the area you represent. Well, why in the world would they set such a low standard, or a seemingly low standard, for our representatives? And it was because the assumption, remember, back in the very first lecture, we talked about there were certain assumptions, and one of those assumptions was that some people are just better than others and ought to govern. And the Founding Fathers just simply assumed that the average illiterate farmer is not going to run for Congress. He is going to vote for that wealthy planter that lives in the same county, because everybody will be voting for him, because it's just assumed that as the wealthy planter in the same county, he's the one that's going to represent you. But those are the qualifications. 2-year term, and those are the qualifications. Section 3 talks about the Senate. To be a senator, you serve a 6-year term. So again, this is a higher rank, right? A little higher office. You don't have to be reelected every 2 years. You're elected for 6 years. And only 1/3 of the senators come up for reelection every 2 years. So for example, today in the United States, there are 50 states, 2 senators from every state, so there are 100 senators. And 33 of them are up for election every 2 years, and then 34 on the off year. So 1/3 of your Senate is up for election every 2 years, when every member of the House of Representatives is. So it's a 6-year term. What are the requirements? Well, you have to be 30 years old, so you have to be a little older for this higher office. If you're a representative, 25. If you're a senator, 30. You have to be a citizen for 9 years. So you have to have been a naturalized citizen or a natural-born citizen, but you have to have been a citizen for 9 years, not 7. And you, again, have to live in the state you represent. Okay, but again, those are the only requirements. 30 years old, 9 years a citizen, and you have to live in the state that you represent. Section 4 of Article 1, now that we've got the Senate and the House defined and who gets to be in them, talks about how they're elected. This was a rather clever thing that the Constitution did, the Constitutional Convention did rather, because what they did was they couldn't agree amongst themselves on how this should be. Different states had different requirements. Some states had requirements that were very strict. Only certain people, certain very wealthy property owners could vote. Other states, Pennsylvania for example, had almost universal manhood suffrage. So what the Constitutional Convention decided in Article 1, Section 4, was that the states themselves would decide who could vote for their representatives to Congress. And the way they put it was this: however you allow people in your state to vote for your own state legislature, those are the same requirements that they have for voting for Congress. So if you have a state legislature where you can only vote for the, say, Georgia state legislature, if you are a certain property owner, then those are the same requirements to vote for the Georgia delegates to the House of Representatives. If in Pennsylvania, universal manhood suffrage almost, well, then that's the way it can be for Congress. It is important to note that at the original writing of the Constitution, senators were not elected by the people. Today, that's something we do. Today, we vote for our U.S. senators. That's a 20th century amendment. At the time of the writing of the Constitution, the state legislature voted for your senators. So if you're voting in, say, 1790, you are only voting for your representative. You are not voting for your U.S. senator. Article 1, Section 5, talks about the rules and records of each house. It talks about how they're going to keep their records. It talks about the rules for speaking. Article 1, Section 6 talks about pay. It talks about the pay that they're allowed to have and when they cannot raise that pay. Article 1, Section 7, we're going to camp out on for a little bit. This talks about how a bill becomes a law. And it sets down a process that is not as confusing as you might think. So hopefully we'll be able to walk through it together. A bill can be proposed in either office. It can be proposed either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, except for revenue bills. That is to say, any bill that requires spending money, which is most bills, has to begin in the House of Representatives. The Founding Fathers wanted the government's money to be spent, or at least the idea to come from people elected more regularly. But let's just assume for our conversation the bill is proposed in the House of Representatives. It is given a number, H.R. 23. Then that bill goes to committees. Depending upon what the bill is about, it might go to any one of a number of committees. It might go to several committees. And again, today, there might even be subcommittees. So for example, if it is a bill to increase spending for the war on terror, it might go to the Armed Services Committee because they're going to be spending the money. And in the Armed Services Committee, it might also go to the Appropriations Committee, the Budget Committee, any one of a number. And in those committees, the chair of the committee would define how it's going to be spoken on, and it would eventually be voted on in that committee. And most bills never make it out of committee. They hold hearings, and they discuss things, and they decide things. But let's just assume that it does pass each of those committees, that it needs to pass in the House of Representatives. Then it would come to the floor of the House, where again it would be voted on. And let's just say our bill is approved. So it's proposed in the House, it goes through committee hearings in the House, then it's approved by the House itself. At that point, it goes to the Senate. If it had started in the Senate, it would go to the House. In the Senate, once again, it's introduced and it goes again to committees. The Senate has its own committees that it's going to want to do research on and do investigation on and hold hearings on. And again, it might go to 1, 2, 3, a half dozen committees or subcommittees. And it has to pass each of those. If it does so, it comes to the Senate floor, where perhaps, let's just say it's passed. Now, it's passed the House and it's passed the Senate. Not quite there yet. What if, in all of those hearings, somebody has agreed to approve the bill, but only with a certain change? An amendment. I agree to this bill to raise money for the war on terror, but only to a limit of $150 billion. Well, if that amendment was approved in the House, but not in the Senate, it's not the same bill. And so now it has to go to a conference committee. This conference committee is a committee made up of some members of the House of Representatives and some senators to work out an agreement. Okay, we have this version of the bill here in the House. We have this version of the bill here in the Senate. Which one are we going to take? Is there a compromise measure we can work out? What's the deal? And again, for our conversation, let's just assume they work out a deal. The conference committee comes up with a final bill. Now it goes back to the House. It doesn't have to go through all the committees again. It just goes back to the House for approval, back to the Senate for approval. And at this point, if it's passed, now it goes to the president. It's not a law yet. It's just a bill before the president. The president has some options. He can sign it. And if he signs it, the bill is a law. And, a wonderful ceremony is held, usually in the Rose Garden or some fancy place, and commemorative pins are given out. What if he doesn't like the bill? He can veto it. That is to say, the president can say, no, I will not sign this bill. Here are my reasons why. That doesn't kill the bill. It goes back to where it started, and it can override, is the term you'll use, override the president's veto, except there's this one change. The first time through this process, you simply need a simple majority. You simply need to outvote on the committee 15-14. Now you need a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. You see this if you're watching the news a lot, because a president usually is reluctant to veto a bill that he knows will be overridden. So he'll usually kind of figure out, do I have enough votes? Do I have at least, say, 40% of the people on my side to make sure this vote doesn't get overridden? Okay? So if he sends it back, it could be overridden. A third option the president has, besides signing it or vetoing it, he can only use if Congress is about to adjourn. If Congress is within 10 days of adjourning, what the president can do is simply neither. He won't sign it, he won't veto it. It's called a pocket veto. He doesn't literally put it in his pocket, but that's the idea. He just puts it in the desk drawer, and if Congress adjourns within 10 days, the bill dies. And now he doesn't have to run the risk of it being overridden. Again, you can only do this at the very end of a congressional term. Well, that's a complicated procedure, but I think it'll make sense if you kind of think it through. That's what Article 1, Section 7 talks about, how a bill becomes a law. Article 1, Section 8 talks about the powers of Congress. A very lengthy section, begins with powers to lay and collect taxes, establish post roads, declare war, etc. It lists a couple dozen powers that Congress has. And then at the very end is this tagline. It says, Congress shall make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What that means, what is called the necessary and proper clause, or sometimes the elastic clause, is that the founders realized this. We can list all the things Congress can do, but who knows what will come up? Okay, much like the Anti-Federalists in the 9th Amendment said, we want an amendment that says there are other powers or other rights guaranteed to the people, not just the ones you list in the first 8, because who knows what we'll think of. Same idea here. There are going to be other things Congress is going to need to do. Obvious example, regulate, television. How in the world does Congress have the power to regulate television? That couldn't possibly have been listed in 1787. It didn't need to be. It comes under the necessary and proper clause. Okay? It's something, though, that has been a hot debate, because what does that mean? What is necessary and proper? Is this anything? Can Congress make laws whatsoever? This is what the Anti-Federalists were concerned about. They looked at the necessary and proper clause and say, what if Congress decides that it's necessary to establish a national religion? What if Congress decides that it's necessary to allow you to be put on trial several times for the same crime? These were the things that the Anti-Federalists were concerned about. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. Well, Article 1, Section 9 talks about what Congress cannot do. There are some things that Congress cannot do. One is an ex post facto law. That's simply a Latin phrase that means after a fact. They cannot pass a law that makes something illegal after you've already done it. Okay, Congress can't pass a law today making something illegal in 1975 and then come back and say, well, you broke the law in 1975. Congress also can't pass what's called a bill of attainder. A bill of attainder is a law which essentially declares you guilty of a crime. So Congress can't pass a law saying, henceforth it is the law of the land that so-and-so is guilty of such and such a crime. It can't grant titles of nobility and other things like that. And then what Article 1, Section 10, the last one, it states what states cannot do. For example, states cannot coin their own money. States cannot establish their own military or their own tariffs. Anything that's not in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress, and Article 1, Section 10, what states cannot do, remember, because of the 10th Amendment, is a power given to the states. That's the overview of Article 1.